Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Healthy Sex monthly webinar from Mirror of Intimacy. I'm Dr. Alex Katehakis, and today is Monday, September 16th. Every time we start one of these webinars, I can hardly believe a month has gone by since we last had a chat together. So I just want to remind you of a few things. One, if you have any questions at all, feel free to type them into the chat box, and I will happily answer questions for you as best I can. If you want to ask a question anonymously, you can type it into the Q&A box, and then someone in my office will make sure that I see that without naming your name. Otherwise, your name or whatever name you use will show up in the chat box naturally. And also to remind you, which is probably obvious, that today's entry Force is in Mirror of Intimacy, a book that was created about emotional and erotic intelligence. And you can buy that book on Amazon.com at any time. So let's start with this rather provocative word. It's not a word that we often think about with sex, and when we do think about it, we think about it in problematic ways. So the quote from today is from a Native American chieftain who says, "Why do you take by force what you could attain by love?" Which is an interesting question, and one that I think is appropriate for looking at what's going on in our world today and how the world seems to be organized towards warring and taking versus being open-hearted and loving. And when I thought about this topic, I really went back to the first line of the entry in Mirror of Intimacy, which reads, "The force of our most sacred feelings expressed through sexual acts leaves us even more empowered." So it leaves us more empowered when we take the force of our sacred feelings, the force of our love, our longing, our carnal desire for another, and we express it through sex. It leaves us feeling empowered because we've broken psychic barriers to bond with another. And oftentimes people feel so much shame about sex and sexuality that they limit or reduce their sexual expression and keep it in a pretty narrow band instead of letting the full velocity, the full force of their sexual desire, which is, of course, how we invite the erotic into our sexuality. It's not by staying small. It's by expression, full expression of our sensuality, excuse me, whether it's through our voice, our facial expressions, the tonicity of our body, any expression that we have, because sex itself, when reduced to the carnal, to the body, is a very animalistic act. And when we try and shorten that or squash it or dampen it down in some way, then you're going to have, I would say, a more flaccid sexual experience than one that's full-bodied and full of the force of your vital expressions. And so we don't want to confuse that without the force with consent, because these two words should not be confabulated or confused in any way. Because without healthy consent, force just becomes domination over someone else or something else, using manipulation or, at worst, violence. And there's really no place for that in the healthy expression of sex and sexuality. And using force against others that are innocent or that have less power than we have, whether it's a gender difference or it's over children or vulnerable people or even animals, is a vile form of control, and we should all have zero tolerance for that. And that means we intervene on it when we see it. I mean, we have to remember that as recently as the 1970s, marital rape was not considered a crime in this country. And it is absolutely criminal to take anybody by force sexually, regardless of the circumstances. So whether it's an act of violence and an act of domination, let's just leave it at that. And we should also remember that we don't own our partner's sexuality any more than we want our bodies or our sexuality to be owned or dictated to by somebody else. we don't have rights to them. And some people don't dominate or force explicitly or aggressively. They do it more passive aggressively. And so that can be a form of force also. It's sneaky. It's acting like you want something or you don't really care, but you find another way to get it anyway. And so we do not want to be destructive by taking dominion or domination, rather, over another person or being. So if you have any questions about that or thoughts on that topic, I would welcome that you write that message in here. And also to think about if there are times when I have forced somebody to do something they didn't want to do, or I passively aggressively got them to do something they didn't want to do. And seduction, by the way, can be a passive aggressive form of trying to get somebody to do something they don't want to do. And we're doing it under the guise of being playful or sexy or coercing them because we say, oh, come on, it's not that bad, or it's just this one time, or give it a try, or why are you so uptight? Why don't you want to be more adventurous? These are all the ways that we can use seduction as a force rather than as a play state or as an invitation to engage and try new and different things. So I think we see force mirrored back to us today in our collective anger, collective self-loathing. I think that's why we see this massive amount of force, whether it's in autocratic governments or fascist governments, or where people are being forced into doing something they don't want to do, and not allowing humanity's full expression, of course, with boundaries, but also giving space for people to find out what's true for them and giving humanity and all of us the benefit of the doubt, and where we help each other move towards using our brains for love instead of for war. Because our brains are predominantly wired for war. We're wired towards safety and attack if we don't get what we want or need, or if we're going to be attacked, as opposed to being open-hearted and trusting that the other is going to take care of us, or we will get our needs met, and that others will get their needs met too. When we take care of each other, we all get our needs met, as opposed to fighting over bits and pieces and scraps and yours and mine. So when we try to grab power because we think we're not going to get what we want or need, in a way we're trying to outsmart the universe and some basic laws, natural laws that show us that indeed, we do have an abundant universe. And if our path is laid out for the highest good, then growth ensues. And growth pulls us, into possibility when we get small and we start to work from a place of lack and limitation, and we start grabbing power or stealing or getting greedy or getting passive aggressive, then we will definitely move into a place of suffering. And we won't get what we want and need. And this can be seen, I'm sure all of us have had the experience of wanting to be in a love relationship and not quite knowing how to get into it. And so we could try to coerce somebody we meet, or bully them, or shame them, or seduce them when maybe they don't really want it. And that ultimately doesn't work out. It creates suffering for both parties. And we're left feeling like nothing ever works out for me, or nobody loves me, or nobody wants to be with me, when in fact we were pushing against something that wasn't really happening to begin with. So take a look at or think about the ways that you put pressure on life or the systems around you because you're trying to grab power and you're using force to get what you want and need, instead of carefully waiting for something to show up that's appropriate for you. So someone said they just listened to On Being with Kristen Tippett, which is a podcast, interviewing Father Richard Rohr, and he says, I highly recommend this. And a portion of it was talking about this idea of father hunger that resonates within most of the men he works with. This notion that our millennial generation has quite a great deal of work to do to tap into this deep, deep rage for not having a father that taught us how to be a man, which I think is incredibly accurate. In active addiction, the control I had over my qualifier meaning the person that qualifies someone to be a sex or love addict, is what drove me to act out over and over again. What do you suggest should be a focus for me in early recovery to help me remove my rage from my sexuality? So there's a lot in what you're saying here. So when males don't have fathers bringing them into adulthood, and I think this is not just for millennials, I think this started after World War II when fathers were coming home from war and they were suffering from post-traumatic stress. They didn't have purpose in life and purpose in our culture. We started to become a more mechanistic, industrialized culture. And so the battlefield moved from and I shouldn't call it a battlefield, but men's purpose moved from providing for their families by way of a maybe perhaps more agrarian culture where we were literally hunting and gathering to the workplace, to the workforce, where it became about, acquisition and money and greed. And increasingly, men became less and less necessary as women entered the workforce in the 70s. And now we have a whole generations of men that are angry, that feel disenfranchised, that feel what Susan Faludi called ornamental in our culture. And so not knowing how to be a man has become a problem across the board for men, whether they're addicts or not, because we're all being raised by the consumer culture. And oftentimes when men leave their families, women end up raising men, and we end up raising men according to how we see men should be or how we have our feelings, which often doesn't do men a service either. So recognizing that in active addiction, you were trying to have control over women or the woman that was in your life, is a way of that's about conquest, and it's about force and control so as not to be abandoned. Because if you were abandoned, you're going to try to grab people. Even in SLAA and Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, they talk about taking hostages, which is not really a functional relationship. So working to remove your rage from your sexuality is going to take time. When you can stop being angry at women for not loving you, for abandoning you, for not wanting you, that's the first step. And at some point, whereas we can't, there's a paradox in the saying that you have to love yourself before other people can love you. And yet the way we learn to be loved is from the time we're babies. And so we learn to be loved because we're lovable when we are babies, if we're growing up with people that take good care of us. So it's both and, it's not either or. So finding people that love you and accept you for who you are is a good first step. And typically people find that in the fellowship in their program. Finding people that genuinely care about you, that are helping you, that recognize that you are a good person. Having a good therapist that works relationally, where you feel like that therapist cares about you and feels you and loves you and is looking out for you is enormously curative. And then finding, in early recovery, it's really about finding groups, and fellowship is usually the best group for being with people that care deeply about you. And when you can start to have the feeling of being loved by others, then you can really start to work on your own self-love and see that these stories that you tell yourself or the programming that you got because your parents were abandoning of you are no longer true. And we're not children anymore, we're adults. So we have to start filling ourselves up with activities and people that reflect back to us that we do matter, that we're valuable, and that we're lovable. And once you do that, and you have a slow and steady experience of your rage going down about not getting what you want and need, and getting it from adult people around you and giving it to yourself, then you can start to date in healthy and appropriate ways. Someone writes, when groups of people see physical violence in public, like yelling and fighting as examples, and most do not take action against it and simply watch, is that mainly the bystander effect or something else happening in our brains? Well, there is something, called contagion that definitely happens amongst human beings. We think about it as being a lemming, where we all sort of line up and do what the dominant theme around us is. Um, and so I think when people see violence in public, and they don't do anything about it, it's because they're frozen or afraid because nobody else is doing anything about it. And if one brave soul steps forward and says, stop, typically one other person and then two other people and then a group of people will come forward to assist in the stopping of it. Otherwise, we collectively sit in this freeze state. And it's like if you go to a movie and you see something that is disturbing, but it's also funny, um, sometimes an audience will laugh together, and sometimes an audience won't laugh at all. And so your impulse about whether to laugh or not is going to be mitigated and registered by, is it okay to laugh? Isn't it okay to laugh? And this happens in a split second. You might be laughing in your head, but if nobody around you is laughing, you won't. But if you think it's funny and the guy next to you starts laughing, hysterically, then you'll have permission to laugh also. So these are good things to pay attention to when we are in public and we are with other people. And I would say that same contagion exists in sex and sexuality. If you're with a partner who's not breathing during sex, who's not making any noises, who's not speaking, then you're going to feel more shameful and more shut down or less inclined to have the full force of your sexual expression also. And so part of this has to do with the way in which we resonate and align and get into synchrony with each other. So some of it is truly neurobiological, and some of it is more psychological if we don't feel entitled to, or we're more caretaking to, or quite quote codependent of the other, we won't do what's true for us. So some of it is a physical reaction and some of it's a psychological reaction. But all of them are worth noting. So be thoughtful about anything that you force on people based out of a sense of inadequacy. And I would say rage comes from a feeling of inadequacy. I think rage is an expression of extreme anxiety. And if you grow up with somebody who's raging all the time, then that becomes a habituated way of communicating. Because your system's very quick to anger, because that's how it was entrained. That's how it was taught, you could say. And so look at the rage that pops up and ask yourself, how anxious am I that I'm not getting what I want when I want it right now? And can I take a deep breath and take a look at the situation, like keep my prefrontal cortex, my operating system online, to look at the rational and logical circumstances to say, does this really warrant anger, or am I just in a reactivity state right now? And when we do that, we start to make a change. We don't start to think that every person is our last opportunity, or we're just never going to get what we want and need. That's an anxiety-driven thought. And we start to see that the world is not a scarce place, that it is an abundant place, and we can have what's our portion of it if we have an open heart and we start to manage these internal struggles and strifes. And when you consider that you live in an abundant universe, there's an infinite supply of good for everybody. There's no lack, there's no limitation, there's plenty. You have food, you have water if you're fortunate. And when you have basic food, clothing, shelter, you are in an abundant universe, because many, many people the world over don't have that. There are people suffering right now that don't have water, let alone food. They don't have shelter, they live outdoors. And so see if you can calibrate your recognition of lack and limitation and abundance, and not feel like you've got to go bashing around to get what you want and need, but start to be in deep gratitude for what you already have and see what starts to show up as a result of that. So surrender to what life has in store for you. And try to step out of trying to force anything to happen. And again, I think that's paradoxical, because when we want something, we cannot just passively sit by and just trust that it's going to magically happen. We have to do the next indicated action. We have to do the right things to get what we want and need, whether it's make a phone call to somebody or write a letter, or go to an interview, or take a class to sharpen skills, or learn a new skill. We have to be actively involved in our lives to get what we want and need, but then we have to quietly wait for those things to show up. There's only so much you can do, but when you start to manipulate and you start to seduce and you start to control and you start to go after, that creates more problems, and you're more inclined to get less of what you want, not more of what you want when you try that. So I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts or comments about that. So when I think about lovemaking, then, I think it's important to describe the different levels of force that take place during lovemaking. What turns you on and why? When you think about the word force, is it the force of your love and open-heartedness? Is it the force of feeling a body up against your body, or being on top of a body or under a body? What about that is arousing to you? Do you seek to be conquered or to be the conqueror? And how does this affect your capacity for a heartfelt connection? For many people, we could use the language of dominance and submission. Those are forces, those are energies in sex, and it does not mean that anybody is doing anything violent or wrong. Because if it's consensual, then it isn't violent or wrong. So what about this notion of force is appealing to you in sex? What scares you about it in sex? And how much are you talking about it with your partner? And then consider also the ways that you try to control your life. What are you doing that's controlling right now? And when do you use force to get what you want when you want it? And when does that work, and when does it backfire? I find myself often trying to control my life, thinking that, I want something different than what I have, but I don't even know what that is, oddly enough. When I really challenge myself about it, I think, well, what do you want? What would be different than what you had? Where would you go? Where would you move? Where would you live? And I often come up with a blank. And typically, I'm trying to force something rather than being in gratitude for what is. So Stephen writes, sexuality in my family of origin was considered sinful and abhorrent. So that's going to be a problem right off the bat. So a lot of my acting out happened in secrecy and shame, which absolutely makes sense. It makes perfect sense. So all of my affairs, I forced the women to keep the secret with me, and it caused extreme arousal for me. So that makes sense also, that secrecy, because the dirtier it is, meaning the more secretive it is, means it's dirty. And if it's dirty, there's shame dynamics in that, and therefore the act is arousing to you. To do it in plain, open, ways, to have an explicit conversation with someone, to really be seen, is going to feel a different kind of shameful for you. And then forcing women to keep the secret is really perpetrating a form of violence on them also. And this form of secrecy was propelled by my ability to compartmentalize everything I was doing, of course. So what is it about the secrecy that creates arousal? Well, as I said early on, the idea of secrecy and sin and sex were fused together. So that means when sex is secret, it's furtive, that means it's dirty and it's wrong. And that can be very arousing to our brains and to our bodies. And so when you can start to be transparent about what's truthful for you sexually, what's arousing to you, what you like, And to have sex from that place for the first time might be really challenging for you. It may feel kind of ordinary or boring. But I would really challenge you to go through that phase first. And I lay these phases out in Erotic Intelligence, where I talk about healthy sex. And then that moves to intimate sex and erotic sex. And the erotic in this case would be play acting the secrecy, play acting that which is sinful or dirty, but you know that it's an act, and so does your partner, and you're in agreement about this role play, which is very different than manipulating somebody and then feeling terrible or wrong or dirty or more shameful about sex afterwards. So you see, there's really a shift in perception. The first one is secretive, it's shaming, it's abusive, it leaves you feeling terrible afterwards. The second one is more explicit and transparent and taking ownership that you like sex that's a little bit dirty, or when it's secretive, it's more arousing for you. Okay, that's not the worst thing in the world, but now you're going to have a partner who's in agreement with you that you are going to role play that in a very particular way. And you've got to be explicit about what the roles are and what the rules are. And also in my workbook, Sexual Reflections, that workbook has people writing out very explicitly what turns them on and what they like, so that you can share it with a partner. And that's what shifts something from being, quote, unhealthy and dysfunctional to being more functional and healthy sexuality. And Paul says, I'm wondering whether you are talking about being engaged in our life as the necessary base, and then within the engaging, the alternative to force is to allow. Well, I'm not sure about how exactly you're using that language, but yes, I think when we're engaged in our lives, that means that we're present. That is the necessary base for sex and sexuality. And you could say that, the alternative of force is to allow whatever happens to emerge. That's true too. But I think the word force has a couple of meanings here. There is life force, which is vitality and aliveness and the force of expressing our feelings. All of that is, I would label that, quote, good, which is a judgment, but it's still an essential part of vitality. And so I don't want to get rid of the word force or only name it bad, because we think of force linked up with rape or non-consensual sex, and that is precisely what I'm not talking about. So we want to allow the force of our expressions to come forward, but then we want to allow whatever emerges from that, as opposed to strong-arming somebody into getting what they want when they want it. And so someone says, I grapple with the difference between using force and being proactive, which is great because that's a very thin slice there. Can you elaborate on the difference of achieving your goals versus using force to make things happen? Well, I think you definitely have to move your feet. You've got to make a plan. You've got to list your goals. You've got to look at what actionable steps you can take, making phone calls. So here's an example. If you want a job somewhere, you have to go through the channels of getting that job. So first you find out who you email, and then you realize, oh, I'm in a sea of 100 emails or more. And so you write a cover letter maybe, or you call a friend or somebody you know to find out if they know anybody in that company. And when they give you the name and an email address of a particular person, then you write a cover letter and you let them know how enthusiastic you are about working there and that you're hoping for an interview. And then maybe you find out if they have an open interview day. Like, you're doing everything you can through the proper channels to get what you want. But if you find out the name of the person you're supposed to email, and then you start to stalk them lightly, you find out which coffee shop they go to because you're following them during the day, or you manage to bump into them at the gym, then you're starting to cross a line. You're starting to cross boundaries, and that boundary becomes a violation of what the person's personal space. And that person will very quickly shut you down because they don't want to have anything to do with you, and they're not going to want to work with you. So it's about, where do you do what's appropriate, become proactive, but don't cross a boundary that violates another person's space. And someone writes, my husband's been identified as an eroticized rage sex addict, which is an interesting term because um, most sex addicts possess some form of eroticized rage, but I've never heard somebody identified in that way. He's still unable to feel empathy. Can you explain the reasons behind this? Well, unfortunately, I can't because I don't know your husband. And so any crack I would take at this is really a broad stroke. So I would say that, it's really up to him to understand why he's so angry and if he uses anger against women as a retaliatory function, and where the problem is for him, if indeed he doesn't feel any empathy related to, perhaps women or other people. That's a long-term therapeutic question. It's not a question I can just answer right off the bat. But these questions really require deeper therapy with somebody over time, and being in program and 12-step meetings where people learn to have empathy for each other, they learn to help each other. That's really what you're looking for. And someone writes, from what you were saying, it's an interesting viewpoint that force is almost a result of scarcity, and how in an abundant world it's not necessary. Well, I'm not saying that exactly. I think force, if we think about the word force tied to the word life force, I do think it's necessary. But I think if you live in a purview that the world is abundant, it's not scarce, then you don't have to go through the world strong arming it to get what you want and need. So it goes without saying, but also interesting that when you're forcing something, it means you're exerting control over something. Wouldn't naturally be that way. Can you please elaborate on the good version of force? Okay, so I think I answered that question, but I'll try again. So when you think about life force, that is a vitality state in the body that we all possess. And if you're depressed or highly anxious, you won't be able to feel your life force. And without your life force, you will not move out into the world. You won't take action. You won't go after what you want and what you need appropriately. You won't feel entitled to joy, to jump up and down, to scream at a baseball game or a football game. People probably don't scream so much at baseball. Maybe they yell. To really exert the force of who you are. That is life force. That's the good version of force, is saying, I'm here, I'm expressing myself, I feel entitled to ask for what I want and need appropriately. And without that, you're going to have problems. You're going to be sort of standing on the sidelines of life. Bad force is when you exert domination over someone without their consent. And I would make it that simple, because people like to be dominated sexually with consent. And so don't confuse the word as being carte blanche to do something without consent. It requires consent. So when force is our internal state, our internal life force, I think you have a green light with it. When it involves another person, you have to get consent before you can exert it on them. And when it involves crossing boundaries, violating personal space, then you're out of bounds with it. So take a look at this week as you go along, what domineering or passive aggressive behaviors you engage in. And think about what you need to do in order to lessen those destructive behaviors in your life, because it can be super subtle. It can be as subtle as, talking to your partner about the way something went and making it about them screwing up, instead of saying, we could do better on our agreements with each other, or we could do better when we talk to your parents or my parents. We could do better about being nicer to them, as opposed to, you need to be better at being nicer to your parents or my parents. That can be a passive aggressive or sometimes directly aggressive dig or force in our relationships, as opposed to saying, what, we're in this together. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. Both of us could do better when we have people over for dinner or people over for company, as not being as snarky with each other. as opposed to you said this and no, I didn't, and yes, you did. So how are we working together? That's a way to examine passive aggressive behavior. Somebody writes, women seem to struggle more often to express their needs and wants sexually and also in relationships. Please, can you offer any tips, guidance to overcome the way they have been over-socialized? Well, this is a huge conversation in our culture right now. And I think women are struggle to express their needs because we're socialized to be polite, oftentimes to serve the masculine, to not be too aggressive or quote bitchy. Also that it's dirty or wrong or shameful to have sexual needs, much less express what we want and need. And so I think when you can be appropriately assertive, when you can ask for what you want, in a matter-of-fact way, just like if your partner was going to the grocery store and you said, before you go, would you please get me a few things? There's some things I would like. And I wish you asked me more often before you were going if there's something that you want me to get. And so being proactive about saying what you want, and also in a way teaching each other, teaching our partners about how we want to be talked to, about what our wants and needs are, because we can't possibly know that going into a relationship. Your partner cannot know your likes and your dislikes. And we can't expect people just to mind read or sort of figure this out as we go along. I mean, we do figure it out as we go along, but the longer we're with somebody, the more we have figured it out. But even then it can take time because we're not really asking, or we're not paying close enough attention, or we're not inside each other's heads. We don't know. We all process things differently. We all have different expectations. There are different things that trigger us. And if you don't ask and if you don't tell, if you're not explicit about saying what's true for you, then you can't possibly know. So a good practice would be to talk to each other about these things. I would encourage you to sit down with your partner and talk about, let me tell you what I really like sexually and what I don't like sexually, and what do you really like and what don't you like. And when I say something and it feels like you're not paying attention, is it that you're not really, or because you can do two things at once and also hear me? Because I can't do two things at once, and I feel like you're not listening to me when you do that. So being in an open, transparent dialogue starts to force the issue of not forcing each other into doing things we don't want to do. So any other thoughts or questions about this topic here? And any thoughts about, or think about, what are the ways that you can look at your own passive aggressive behaviors during the week? Look at the ways that you cut corners to get what you want, even though you're not getting what you want. So you're sort of, manipulating your partner into doing it instead of being, straightforward and direct, and just asking for your wants and needs. So dare to express your life force, I guess, is the message I want to leave you with today. Think about what your life force is, what the messages are that you got as a child that have shut you down, and think about what you want to be expressing and saying. Because when you can start to do it in your relationship, then you'll get bolder in doing it in your workplace. And with your friends and across the board. It's so important to be able to say, you hurt my feelings, or I didn't like the way that went, or I need you to do this for me, so the other person can and hear you. And when we're on the receiving end of that, we have to be able to listen without going into shame and defensiveness and making the other person feel terrible about it. We have to be able to manage our anxiety and our bruised egos, and to say, you know what, it's really hard to hear that I was offensive to you, or that I interrupted you, or that I said something behind your back and I shouldn't have. But you know what? You're right about that. I shouldn't have done that. And I appreciate you telling me, and I'm going to do what I can to correct that. So thank you for telling me. I appreciate that. And that is a way of being intimate with each other, to really expressing our life force in a direct, explicit way, being able to hear it when somebody gives it back to us without getting defensive or spiraling into shame, holding on to ourselves and being able to own our part in us, because none of us are perfect. We're all perfectly imperfect, as Pia Melody says. We're all doing the best we can. We are all high maintenance, as Stan Tatkin says. Many people that talk about psychological health and well-being point us in the direction of seeing that we all have issues. We all process differently. We all love differently. We all listen differently. We all have different love languages. And so we cannot expect our partners to be just like us. We have to be curious about who they are and ask that they be curious in return about us. And we have to be good listeners as well. And somebody says, so what would you advise for people who are overly accommodating and thinking about other needs over theirs? Well, I'm constantly rationalizing bad behavior and reasoning it, perhaps to avoid speaking my truth. Well, I think you actually nailed it. That when we are so focused on other people around us and accommodating their needs, then we are putting ourselves in a victim position. And those people look like heroes. They look like they're so giving and kind and accommodating, but actually they're exhausted, they're resentful, and they're avoiding looking at their own lives. Because oftentimes we accommodate and take care of people that are lying and cheating because we don't want to deal with the fact that we should really leave those people. And so we're picking the pain of accommodation and not growing and not being truthful about who we are over the pain of leaving that person, which is going to force us to grow. And many times people avoid personal growth and development in service of what I would call more codependent behaviors and having what I would also call a fixer-upper. So if you're in relationship with somebody who is a fixer-upper, you're always trying to prop them up and get them to tell the truth and do the right thing, and they're often cheating and lying and all of that, then that's on you. They're not doing anything different than they've ever been doing. They're not misrepresenting themselves. You're choosing to stay in that relationship because you don't want to face the pain of saying goodbye to them. And that can be a manipulation, and that can be a form of domination, even though it doesn't look that way. It looks very passive, it looks nice, and it looks accommodating. All right, so on this 16th day of September, I want to challenge you to dare to express your life force today and this week, to dare to speak your truth in honest and respectful ways. When you feel yourself wanting to be passive aggressive or manipulative, see if you can stop yourself and say, I'm going to do something different today. I'm going to risk being authentic. I'm going to risk speaking up for myself and what I want and need, and trust that the right thing will emerge and the right thing will happen. So thank you, Paul, who writes for the Stimulating Conversation, for being part of the conversation. And thank you all for showing up. I appreciate your time and hope you have a beautiful September as we transition into fall. And I'll look forward to talking to you in October. And again, if you have any questions, remember that our intake counselors are always standing by to talk to you at 310-843-9902, and that you can purchase Mirror of Intimacy on our Amazon site.